Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Settle in. Dim the lights. Let the hum of your fan blend with the quiet rhythm of another forgotten truth resurfacing. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of one of the most persistent lies in popular history. The one that claims medieval people thought the earth was flat. A myth so common that it shows up in cartoons, memes, classroom jokes, and bedtime trivia. You know the one, brave modern thinkers standing on ships' decks staring into the ocean, whispering. They all thought we'd fall off the edge. As if Christopher Columbus rolled the dice and everyone else held their breath. As if the entire medieval world mistook the planet for a pizza. But here's the twist. They didn't. Not even remotely. By the time your average monk was dipping his quill into ink in the 1200s, educated folks across Europe already accepted the earth as a sphere. Not some bold guess, not a dangerous theory whispered in dark corners, but a basic, boring scientific reality, as ordinary as rain and taxes. In fact, you could walk into a monastery library in 1320, leaf through a manuscript, and find diagrams of globes, complete with notes on latitude, time zones, and even shadow theory. This wasn't fringe knowledge. It was standard. It was accepted. It was, in their own words, common sense. So why do so many people today, in the age of Google Maps and Starlink satellites, still believe medieval scholars thought Earth was flat? Well, that's a story about arrogance, empire, and just a bit of 19th century marketing genius. See, the flat Earth myth wasn't invented in the Middle Ages. It was retroactively projected onto them by writers in the 1800s. Many of whom were desperate to show how superior they were to the so-called Dark Ages. Because if you want to make yourself look smart, it helps to make the people behind you look really, really dumb. One of the main culprits? Washington Irving. Yes, the same guy who wrote Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. In his biography of Columbus, he dramatically described the brave sailor facing down a council of scholars who thought he might fall off the edge of the earth. It was cinematic. It was thrilling. It was also complete nonsense. Columbus didn't argue the shape of the planet. Everyone already agreed it was round. What he debated was its size. And spoiler alert, he was wrong. He drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference. He thought Japan was a quick sail west. Instead, he crashed into an entirely different continent. But let's get back to those medieval monks, shall we? Picture yourself in a small stone monastery in southern England. The year is 1320. The scent of wax and vellum fills the air. You're bent over a thick manuscript, copying lines from an ancient Greek text. Outside, rain taps gently on the wooden shutters. A cat snoozes on the sill. And in the margin of your manuscript, you pause and sketch a small globe, a tilted circle with the sun and moon hovering in neat arcs above it. You're not a rebel. You're not a heretic. You're just a copyist doing your job. Because to you, and to your teachers, and to their teachers, the earth is a sphere. Always has been. Always will be. Educated people in medieval Europe had access to Aristotle, Ptolemy, and other classical thinkers whose works survived through translations, often preserved by Islamic scholars during the earlier centuries. These texts clearly describe a round earth, with arguments ranging from lunar eclipses to the way ships disappear hull first over the horizon. Scholars at universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford taught these ideas openly. There was no church cover-up, no secret police tearing down spherical maps, just dusty books, sharp minds, and some very tired eyes. So where did the darkness come from? Why do we associate this period with ignorance? It's branding. The term Dark Ages was coined by Renaissance humanists, especially those living in Italy, who saw themselves as torchbearers of reason emerging from centuries of cultural stagnation. They blamed the intervening years for losing the classical knowledge they so deeply admired. But this was more PR than fact. In truth, much of that knowledge had been preserved, translated, and even expanded upon by generations of thinkers in monasteries, mosques, and early universities across Europe and the Middle East. By calling everything between Rome and the Renaissance dark, they weren't describing reality. They were advertising their own enlightenment. The myth of the flat earth medieval peasant terrified of falling off the edge of the world, became a convenient caricature, one that was repeated, exaggerated, and eventually taught as fact. Even today, textbooks and children's shows parrot this nonsense. It's comforting, simple, a neat little tale of progress, but it's wrong. If anything, our modern obsession with dunking on the Middle Ages says more about us than it does about them. We like to believe we've come so far, that we've escaped superstition and ignorance, that we're rational beings ruled by science and reason. But then we scroll through conspiracy forums, fall for YouTube rabbit holes, and base our understanding of history on memes and movie plots. Who's the flat earther now? Here's the quiet truth. Medieval people were often smarter than we give them credit for. They lived in a world with fewer distractions, fewer shortcuts, and a deeper dependence on observational learning. They charted the stars. They timed their crops by the equinox. They tracked tides and shadows and celestial movement with tools so precise. Modern historians still marvel at them. They may not have had space programs, but they certainly understood space. And yet, we mock them. We laugh at their supposed ignorance while ignoring the complexity of their world. A world where faith and logic coexisted, where scholarship happened by candlelight, and where the sky wasn't just something to look at. It was something to study, to map, to revere. Tonight, we start our slow journey through all the lies you've been told about the Middle Ages. Lies that flatten, oversimplify, and sterilize an era far more fascinating than most Netflix documentaries would have you believe. We'll travel through plague rooms, kitchens, battlefields, and churches. We'll meet women who ruled, peasants who travelled, and surgeons who stitched up heads without flinching. But for now, just remember this. The people of the Middle Ages did not think the earth was flat. We did. We made that up. They didn't think they'd fall off the edge. They knew better. We forgot. And just like that, another layer of myth crumbles, exposing something far more human underneath. Because, if we're willing to believe that medieval people were ignorant enough to fear falling off the planet, it's hardly surprising that we've also been taught they spent centuries wallowing in filth, allergic to soap and water. The cliché goes something like this. No one bathed, ever, and the Middle Ages stank so badly you could smell a castle before you saw it. But here's the quieter truth, hiding behind that loud image. Medieval people did care about cleanliness. They washed, soaked, perfumed, and scrubbed more often than most modern portrayals would ever allow. Not everyone, and not all the time, but far more than we've been taught to imagine. In fact, for much of the early and high medieval period, bathing was not just common, but often ritualized. Public bathhouses dotted cities across Europe. Some were built over natural hot springs, while others were heated manually, using fires beneath copper-lined tubs or stone cauldrons. In London, entire districts were known for their bathhouses. Southwark had stews, no, not soup, but a term borrowed from the old French estouve, meaning steam. These stews were public, sometimes rowdy, and sometimes even morally suspect by church standards, but they remained popular for generations. In Germany, towns like Nuremberg and Regensburg developed a thriving bathhouse culture, complete with menus, attendants, and little musical ensembles to entertain bathers while they soaked. Some even offered food and wine alongside their scrubbing services. Of course, access varied. A noblewoman might have a private wooden tub filled with flower-scented water, warmed by servants who ladled steaming buckets from the hearth. A peasant might wash in a basin using cloth and soap made from tallow and ash. But the act of cleansing the body, whether through full immersion or partial washing, was not foreign to the era. It was part of the rhythm of life. Monasteries often allowed monks to bathe once a week, more during summer, and their hygiene routines included regular hand and face washing before meals, after labour, and during liturgical observances. The myth that people avoided water altogether is rooted not in medieval reality, but in something more recent, plague logic. During the Black Death and later outbreaks, some doctors came to believe that bathing opened the pores, allowing dangerous miasmas, foul air filled with illness, to enter the body. This belief was especially popular in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, during times of crisis. And so, in periods of disease, some people did avoid full-body baths, but they didn't stop cleaning themselves. Instead, they pivoted to dry methods, wiping the body with clean linen cloths, changing into fresh undergarments, rubbing the skin with herbs or perfumed powders. The result wasn't laziness, it was fear. And in their world it made a kind of sense. If water might kill you, linen became your armour. It's worth noting how much effort even the poorest people put into clothing cleanliness. Underclothes were made of linen, not wool, and these were regularly washed. Archaeological digs and written records show that even rural homes often had washtubs, paddles, and ash soap for laundry. Clean undergarments were a marker of decency. Even when outer layers were worn and patched, travellers kept changeable linens. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, all of them stopped at rivers, wells, and bathhouses when they could. Diaries from the time don't dwell on it, but the practice was embedded in daily routine. And then there's the matter of smell. If you lived in a world before chemical deodorants, antiseptic wipes and climate-controlled homes, you adapted. People used herbs, rosemary, lavender, thyme, not just for cooking, but for body care. They chewed parsley to freshen breath, carried pomanders filled with cloves and cinnamon, and sometimes burned fragrant resins in their rooms. Were they spotless by modern standards? No, but they weren't oblivious to odour either. They noticed, they cared, and they managed in ways that made sense within their world. The real turning point in European bathing culture didn't come until the 16th and 17th centuries. Ironically, as medical science advanced, as Renaissance physicians clung to the idea that water might weaken the body, bathhouses began to close, some condemned as morally corrupt, others abandoned during waves of epidemic. It wasn't the ignorant medieval peasant who stopped bathing. It was the anxious early modern aristocrat, terrified of invisible threats, wrapped in perfumed fabrics and doused in powder. Still, the image stuck. Over time, the dirty Middle Ages became a shorthand, a visual punchline. Filthy faces, greasy hair, plague pits and chamber pots dumped from windows. And yes, some of that happened. Cities were crowded, sewage systems were rudimentary, and not everyone had the time or resources to maintain personal hygiene. But the same could be said for Victorian slums, 18th century London, or early industrial Chicago. Dirt was not unique to the medieval period. Our memory of it is. Even language plays a role in cementing these myths. The word medieval has been used as an insult in modern politics, courtroom rants, and cable news tirades. It implies brutality, backwardness, and decay. But that says more about the speaker than the time period, because in reality, medieval people practiced hygiene in forms suited to their environment, their climate, and their knowledge. They didn't have toothpaste, but they had tooth powders. They didn't have shampoo, but they had herbal rinses. They didn't carry Purell, but they boiled cloth, hung it to dry, and prayed it would be enough. It's easy to mock what we don't understand. Harder to recognise that our ancestors, even in the harshest centuries, still valued dignity. They found ways to stay clean, not just for health, but for ritual, for community, for comfort. Imagine living in a one-room cottage with 6 others, working in fields all day, eating what little you could afford, and still making time to heat water, wash linens, and scent your clothing with wild rosemary. This isn't about romanticising the past. It's about correcting the record. They weren't perfect, they didn't always smell like daisies, but they weren't clueless either. They weren't trudging through life oblivious to their own stench. They were navigating a world of mud and fire and cold, and doing what they could to stay human inside it. So, no, they didn't think the earth was flat, and no, they didn't go their entire lives without bathing. They were more like us than we'd ever admit, and just maybe, they deserve better than the punchline we turn them into. They deserve better than the punchline we turn them into. But the jokes kept coming. Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking whether the stories made sense and just accepted them as facts. Like the one about iron chastity belts. You've probably seen them in museums or in awkward illustrations. A heavy metal contraption, locked around a woman's waist, complete with rivets, clasps, and often an impossibly jagged design that makes you wince just looking at it. According to legend, these were issued by jealous husbands or departing crusaders to ensure their wives remained untouched while they were away. It's a story of control, of fear, and of some truly horrifying underwear. But like so many things we've inherited from the past, this story is more about us than about them. Most chastity belts displayed today are fakes, and not even clever ones. Many of the so-called medieval belts were actually manufactured in the 18th or 19th centuries. Some were made as jokes, others as curiosities, or part of bizarre Victorian museum collections that enjoyed shocking the public with salacious interpretations of history. A few were created for medical or moral instruction, often designed more to titillate or terrify than to document reality. There is almost no credible evidence that real women in medieval Europe were regularly locked into these devices by paranoid husbands. In fact, the design itself is a giveaway. Many of these belts are so poorly constructed that any movement, let alone walking or urinating, would be impossible. If these were used at all, they were more likely theatrical props or satirical exaggerations. Renaissance artists often sketched absurd versions of chastity belts, sometimes as punchlines about overprotective men or foolish attempts to guard what couldn't really be guarded. The key was often comically oversized, the lock cartoonish. It was satire long before it became fact. And yet, despite the lack of evidence, the image endured. Just like flat earths and filth-filled cities, the chastity belt found a permanent place in pop culture's imaginary Middle Ages. And once again, the real history was flattened to make room for a more dramatic, more restrictive, more marketable version of the past. It's a pattern that shows up everywhere, even in our sense of medieval fashion. If you close your eyes and imagine a medieval village, odds are you see a muddy road, some chickens, and a group of people in clothes that could be described as 50 shades of burlap. Everything brown, everything grey, maybe the occasional splash of blood, red or dirty white, but mostly dust and mud and dull fabric. But this isn't a memory, it's a filter. It's the grimy lens of 20th century film and television, applied over centuries of colour and culture. The reality was far more vivid. Medieval clothing, even among commoners, often used rich colours, not neon or synthetic of course, but deep, bold hues from natural dyes. Woad gave blue, madder root gave red. Weld, a humble flowering plant, produced a bright yellow that still appears in preserved garments. Indigo, once imported from distant lands, became a prized commodity. Sumac and oak galls gave deep browns and blacks. And the quality of the dye wasn't always about wealth. Even poorer townspeople might have a dyed hood or tunic, a strip of coloured trim, a woven sash in a local pattern. These weren't walking piles of rags. They were people who celebrated colour when they could afford it, and they did more than just wear it, they lived with it. Walls were painted, textiles were embroidered, festival wagons were decorated in ribbons and flowers. Markets were filled with baskets of painted eggs, glazed pottery, and bolts of dyed wool. May Day celebrations exploded in garlands, streamers, and hand-coloured banners. Tournaments weren't grim grey affairs, they were theatrical, colourful performances. Knights wore heraldic colours, capes, crests, and fluttering feathers. Their horses were covered in embroidered cloths. The banners flapped like kites in the breeze. Even cathedrals weren't solemn stone caves. Their walls were painted in bright pigments. Their ceilings glowed with gold leaf and stars. The windows poured coloured light onto the floors, blues and reds and greens dancing across stone. And yes, clothing reflected class, but it didn't erase individuality. Sumptuary laws, those famous medieval rules about who could wear what, were often more aspirational than enforceable. A peasant might legally be barred from wearing certain furs or silks, but enforcement was inconsistent. People bent the rules. They borrowed colours from their betters. They stitched something extravagant into something simple. In every generation, humans find ways to decorate themselves. Even among the working poor, the idea that everyone wore identical brown sacks is simply not supported by the evidence. Linen shirts, wool tunics, fur-lined cloaks, leather boots, these were common. And within those boundaries, people chose details that mattered to them. a lace-up neckline, a belt with small iron studs, a single green sleeve to show off dye access. Just because clothing was practical doesn't mean it was dull. You can see this in surviving illustrations, not just of kings and saints, but of shepherds, bakers, scribes. The colours pop, even after centuries of fading. Why then does our modern imagination insist on drenching the medieval world in mud? Part of it is cinematic shorthand. Dull colours make things feel older, rougher, more serious. They suggest struggle and authenticity even when they're misleading. Another reason is Victorian Romanticism. 19th century artists painted the Middle Ages as either golden fantasy or dirty misery, saints bathed in divine light or peasants covered in grime. There was no middle ground, and nuance didn't sell. But underneath all of this, there's something else, something more psychological. We need the Middle Ages to feel different. We need a time that's far enough away to project our fears onto it. We call it dark, not because we understand it, but because we don't. We imagine it grey, joyless, repressive. We reduce it to flat earths, filthy bodies, and iron belts. And then we laugh, relieved that we've moved on. But we haven't really. We still try to police bodies, still fight over who controls what, still mistake colourlessness for seriousness. We just do it with better lighting and smoother fabrics. The people who lived in the Middle Ages had eyes just like ours. They saw the sky. They noticed the blue of the river at dusk, the gold of wheat and sunlight, the red splash of berries in winter. They painted, they danced, they stitched birds into tunics and vines into borders. They didn't spend their lives in grayscale. They lived in colour. It's the stories that faded. So the next time someone says the Middle Ages were brown and lifeless, remember the manuscripts filled with brilliant blues and glowing reds. Remember the painted faces on cathedral ceilings and the bright feathers on tournament helmets. Remember the May Day dancers in their striped ribbons. History wasn't colourless. Only the retelling is. History wasn't colourless. Only the retelling is. And just as we've drained the colour from the clothes and banners, we've done something similar to the people themselves. We've hollowed out their lives into statistics, flat numbers. Life expectancy, 30. Infant mortality, high. And from that, we've crafted an image of a world where no one lived past their prime, where 30-year-olds were grandfathers and 25-year-olds were running out of time. The timeline becomes a countdown. Born, starved, plagued, buried, all before you learn to tie your boots. But, like the chastity belt and the grey tunic, this is a simplification that masks the truth. The number you often see, 35, maybe 30, isn't the age most people drop dead. It's an average, skewed heavily by infant and child mortality. A staggering number of children didn't survive their early years. Diseases spread quickly. Poor nutrition was common. Medical care was limited and unreliable. If you were a toddler in the 14th century, you were navigating a minefield of fever, infection, and accident. And for women giving birth, every pregnancy was a risk. Every labour could become a funeral. But, and this is where the myth splits open, if you made it through childhood, if you survived the early gauntlet of sickness and bad water and whatever passed for doctoring, your chances of living into your 50s or 60s were surprisingly decent. There are parish records, tax rolls, legal documents, and letters that point to adults reaching what we would still consider a full, long life. Not everyone, of course. War, disease, and injury could strike anyone, but the idea that 30 marked the end of a life rather than the middle of one simply doesn't hold. You might have been grey-haired, arthritic, and tired, but you were still around. You might have seen your grandchildren. You might have run a business, tended a field, taught apprentices. You might have watched the world change, year by slow year, the way it always does. People aged. They grew old. They weren't falling over the moment they learned to read, assuming they had the chance to learn at all. And for all the talk of a grim and static age, this was also a time of experimentation, of ideas that flickered briefly and brightly, even if they didn't always take off, quite literally in some cases. In 875 CE, in the city of Cordoba, a centre of learning under Muslim rule, a man named Abbas ibn Firnas strapped wings to his arms and launched himself from a hill. Some say it was a controlled glide. Others say it was more of a theatrical tumble. Either way, he lived. Not unscathed, but alive enough to talk about it afterward. The man had tried to fly. Centuries before the Wright brothers ever saw a gear. This wasn't an isolated incident. Medieval inventors dreamed of flight long before physics caught up with ambition. They sketched wings, studied birds, and pondered how the body might defy gravity. Were their contraptions crude? Absolutely. But so were the first submarines, the first clocks, the first printing presses. Everything begins with clumsy hands reaching for something the world says is impossible. Ibn Firnas wasn't a magician. He was a scholar, influenced by classical texts, Islamic philosophy, and astronomical observation. He'd read, translated, and absorbed the knowledge of Greece, Persia, and India. His attempt wasn't born from whimsy, but from theory. Imperfect, yes, but grounded in a desire to test the limits of the known. That kind of ambition doesn't fit easily into our caricature of the Middle Ages. And yet, there it is, fluttering on the edge of a forgotten manuscript, stitched into the margin of a culture we've written off as backward. And if people like Ibn Firnas were reaching for the skies, others were peering inward. Medieval physicians, flawed as they were, studied the human body with a kind of reverent dread. They performed surgeries, documented symptoms, argued about causes. They stitched wounds, drained abscesses, and removed bladder stones with terrifying tools and steely calm. Not always successfully, but often enough to keep trying. They treated cataracts. Yes, cataracts. There were physicians in the Islamic Golden Age, and later in parts of Europe, who practiced a procedure known as couching, using a sharp instrument to dislodge the clouded lens of the eye. Crude by modern standards, risky, painful, but not mythical, not imaginary. And for those whose vision was partially restored, not insignificant. The tools of medieval medicine included more than just herbs and leeches. There were bone saws, cautery irons, probes, and trepanning drills. The latter used to relieve pressure in cases of head trauma or believed possession. These surgeries weren't common, and they weren't always survivable, but they existed, and so did the knowledge, fragmentary and tangled, that made them possible. Of course, there were plenty of misunderstandings. Balancing humours, bleeding patients, diagnosing illness by astrology or urine charts, all of it makes us roll our eyes now. But it was, at the time, science in motion. A patchwork of observation, belief, trial and error. A messy, deeply human attempt to make sense of pain. And through all this, through illness, aging and experimentation, life kept pulsing on. It didn't stop at 30. It didn't end in grey rags. People grew old. They complained about their backs. They lost teeth. They told stories about what they remembered and worried about what came next. Some probably feared death every day. Others made peace with it. And many, perhaps more than we'd expect, simply lived, past the age we're told they should have. So why do these myths endure? Because averages are easier than complexity. It's simpler to say life expectancy was 30 than to explain how math distorts human stories. It's easier to laugh at flying monks and medieval surgeons than to admit how much they accomplished with so little. And it's certainly more comforting to believe we invented long life and innovation, rather than inherited it from generations of people who, against all odds, kept trying. There's something unsettling about realizing that the past wasn't as primitive as we were told. That people who lived by candlelight and plagued moonlight still asked big questions. That they tried to leave Earth. That they fought to see, to breathe, to heal. With tools we'd consider blunt and logic we might call strange, but hearts that beat with the same stubborn hope. They lived longer than we thought. They dreamed bigger than we remembered. And the myths that shrink them don't just flatten the past, they flatten us. The myths that shrink them don't just flatten the past, they flatten us. Because once we start imagining a world where everyone was doomed to die young, covered in dirt, locked in metal belts, and too scared to leave their village, it's only a short step to believing they were also constantly watching each other burn at the stake. If popular culture is to be trusted, the Middle Ages were one endless witch trial, a parade of terrified women, pointed fingers, firewood, and grim crowds. But like so many historical exaggerations, this picture draws from fragments of truth stretched far beyond recognition. Witch hunts did happen. People were accused, tortured, and sometimes killed. But the image of medieval Europe as a bonfire-lit continent, obsessed with rooting out witches, simply doesn't align with the historical record. In fact, the height of Europe's witch-burning frenzy came much later, during the Renaissance and into the early modern period. The most infamous witch trials, the largest death tolls, and the widespread panic over demonic conspiracies belong to the 16th and 17th centuries, not the 12th or 13th. In much of the Middle Ages, belief in witchcraft existed, but the legal system didn't really treat it as a capital crime. Superstition was rampant, yes. People believed in curses, hexes, healing charms, love potions, and all manner of unseen forces. But being strange or herbal or eccentric wasn't enough to get you tied to a stake. Most accusations were local. Disputes between neighbours, petty grievances, long-standing grudges. When cases did come to trial, punishments were more often penance, banishment, or public humiliation. Executions were rare, especially before the late 1400s. Burning, that most theatrical of punishments, was typically reserved for heretics, people accused of defying official church doctrine. Even then, it was an outcome layered with procedure. Inquisition courts, as terrifying as their reputation might be, often spent years collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and offering chances to recant. The spectacle of spontaneous mob-driven witch-burning is largely a modern invention, shaped more by horror films and Halloween than by medieval court records. But seeds were planted during the later Middle Ages. As Europe faced repeated waves of plague, famine, and political instability, fear began to take deeper root. New theological anxieties emerged, especially around the idea that Satan was not just tempting individuals, but actively organizing a conspiracy against Christendom. This shift in thinking turned witches from lonely hedge healers into supposed members of a vast underground network, a cabal of evil hiding in plain sight. By the time the printing press arrived, these ideas spread faster than fire. Manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, written in the late 15th century, gave detailed, often grotesque instructions for identifying, torturing, and prosecuting witches. But even then, it would take another century for those ideas to truly ignite Europe. So while the terror was real, its timing is wrong in our collective imagination. The average 13th century villager was more likely to accuse a neighbour of theft, adultery, or refusing to return a borrowed chicken than of communing with Satan. And when someone was executed, it was usually for political rebellion, treason, or acts of public violence. Justice wasn't kind, but it wasn't indiscriminate. In fact, medieval legal systems were surprisingly intricate. Courts existed at multiple levels: manorial, ecclesiastical, royal, and while justice was often biased and brutal, it was also procedural. Trials were held, witnesses were called, fines were levied. In many cases, punishment meant community service, temporary exile, or payment in goods. Public execution was a statement, not a routine. And burning? It was reserved for dramatic moments, for heretics, not for every woman with a cat and a knowledge of herbs. There were also stranger cases, ones that reveal how differently the medieval mind interpreted crime and justice. In one particularly bizarre example from 15th century France, a sow and her piglets were put on trial for killing a child. The sow was found guilty and hanged. The piglets were acquitted, with the court declaring they were too young to understand the crime. As absurd as that sounds, the underlying logic wasn't random. Medieval law saw all creatures, even animals, as subject to divine and earthly order. Everything had its place. Everything answered to someone. And it wasn't just animals. Inanimate objects were also punished on occasion. If a building collapsed and killed someone, the structure might be symbolically destroyed. If a tree was thought to be cursed, it might be burned or cut down in a ritual. These acts weren't based on evidence or reason, at least not in the modern sense. They were theatrical, moral performances, ways for a community to assert control in a chaotic world. This same logic applied to accusations of magic and malice. If crops failed, or a baby died, or a storm wrecked a village, people searched for meaning. Sometimes they found it in theology, sometimes in nature, and sometimes, tragically, in each other. But even then, the scale was smaller than we tend to imagine. Most people lived and died without ever seeing a witch trial. Most healers weren't burned, most cats weren't killed. And for all its superstitions, medieval society still had space for ambiguity. Someone might be strange but useful, feared yet tolerated. A woman who brewed potions might also deliver babies. A man who told fortunes might also be the only one who knew how to stop a wound from festering. This doesn't excuse the fear or the violence that did occur, but it places it in context. The Middle Ages weren't a permanent bonfire. They were, like any time, a patchwork of fear and forgiveness, cruelty and community. So when we picture the medieval world as a stage lit by burning witches, we're seeing a distortion, a reflection of later panics superimposed on an earlier time. And in doing so, we obscure the very real, very human systems of justice that actually governed life. They weren't perfect, trials were flawed, power was abused, innocence suffered, but so did complexity, and so did restraint. The people who lived in those centuries didn't spend every day chasing shadows. More often they were hauling water, tending animals, kneading bread, fixing fences, watching the sky, and trying, in their own ways, to live. The fires came later. The fear took time to grow. And the myths we carry, of endless executions, of constant purging, say more about our desire for monsters than they do about the past. The myths we carry, of endless executions, of constant purging, say more about our desire for monsters than they do about the past. And just as we've imagined medieval people as grim executioners and fearful peasants, we've also decided they had no idea how to eat. Ask anyone what food was like in the Middle Ages, and you're likely to hear the same familiar refrain, rotten meat masked by heavy spices. A desperate attempt to cover decay with cloves and cinnamon. The image is so deeply rooted that even people who know better will sometimes repeat it, as if everyone at the banquet table was chewing through rancid mutton, praying the saffron would drown out the stench. But the myth is, again, a distortion of something much more nuanced. The idea that people routinely ate spoiled meat is not just inaccurate, it's illogical. Spoiled meat is dangerous. It can kill you. Even without germ theory, people knew that food gone wrong made them violently ill. No one in any century happily tucked into grey, slimy flesh with a handful of pepper. And if you could afford spices, you could afford fresh meat. That's the part modern assumptions always skip. Spices were expensive, in some cases staggeringly so. They were shipped overland from Asia, traded through markets in the Middle East, carried by merchants across seas, taxed, bartered, and handled by countless hands before reaching a kitchen. Pepper was measured like gold, cinnamon was locked in chests. Saffron was so valuable that theft could lead to execution in some cities. Using these ingredients was a statement, a signal of wealth and status, not a practical fix for bad storage. The very premise collapses when you understand that meat itself was a luxury. In towns and cities, most people didn't eat large quantities of it regularly. Rural families might raise pigs or chickens, but livestock was more valuable alive than dead. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying, and eaten on special occasions. And when it was served fresh, it was usually consumed promptly, sometimes within hours. Refrigeration may not have existed, but urgency certainly did. So why the spices? Because flavor mattered. Because cooking wasn't just survival. It was craft. Medieval cookbooks, yes, actual cookbooks, survived from as early as the 13th century. The Forme of Curie, written by the cooks of King Richard II, includes dozens of recipes that reveal a sophisticated palate. Combinations of sweet and savoury. Sauces thickened with ground almonds or bread. Meats marinated in vinegar and wine. Dishes perfumed with rose water, coloured with saffron, balanced with sugar and salt. And not just meats. Vegetables, grains, legumes, all treated with care. Lentil stews, onion tarts, cabbage in broth, barley with herbs. People experimented. They blended influences from the Islamic world, from France, from the Byzantine court. Dishes travelled along trade routes just like the spices did. Almond milk, popular in Europe long before its 21st century resurgence, was a common base for both sweet and savoury meals. Rice puddings, fruit pastes, candied peels, all regular features in upper-class dining. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was display, identity, occasion. Even colour played a role. Feasts featured foods dyed for effect. Green sauces with parsley, red stews with beetroot, gilded crusts painted with egg yolk and saffron. Some chefs stamped their pastries with decorative patterns. Others shaped marzipan into birds, castles, or flowers. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. If you were wealthy enough to throw a feast, you wanted every dish to shout that fact before anyone took a bite. And spices weren't just dumped on top of meat like camouflage. They were folded into dishes intentionally. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg and cloves weren't exclusively sweet. They were used to enhance stews, sauces and roasts. Think of them less like a desperate disguise and more like a curated soundtrack. An experience designed to balance, impress, surprise. But perhaps the most interesting detail is that flavour wasn't limited to the aristocracy. Peasants too had their own traditions. They used what they had: leeks, onions, garlic, mustard seeds, vinegar. They baked rye bread, made cheese, pickled vegetables and brewed ale. Foraging was common. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion greens, all part of seasonal meals. They may not have had saffron or imported pepper, but they had flavour, they had texture, they had variety when the harvest was kind and the weather fair, and despite assumptions, people didn't just eat the same bland porridge every day. Grain-based meals were common, yes, pottage, gruel or bread-based stews, but these could vary widely depending on what was available. A single pot might contain barley, onions, bits of pork, herbs from the garden, and whatever root vegetables survived the storage pit. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling. And when the rare luxury did appear, honey, nuts, or dried fruit, it was savoured. Which raises the question, why do we still imagine the Middle Ages as a culinary wasteland? Part of the answer lies in class. Modern culture tends to filter history through the lives of the poor, as if they were the default and everyone else a deviation. So if a peasant couldn't afford spices, we assume no one used them. If meat was rare in a village, we decide it was always rare everywhere. We average downward until history becomes a bowl of cold barley and a turnip. Another reason is projection. We've inherited this myth that the past must have been worse in every possible way. Dirtier, sicker, shorter, hungrier, tasteless, colourless, joyless. So we strip the recipes of their richness and imagine a world where cinnamon was a bandage and dinner was something to be endured, not enjoyed. But food history tells a different story. A story of experimentation, celebration, and shared memory. Recipes passed between hands. Flavours passed between cultures. A cook in 1350 might not recognise your air fryer, but she would recognise the instinct to gather, to prepare, to season, to share. And what about that rotten meat? It's not in the recipes. It's not in the records. It's not in the archaeological finds. It's in the footnotes of textbooks, in the back alleys of assumptions. It's one of those strange fictions that's too convenient to kill. But it deserves to be retired, because they didn't drown their food in spice to hide rot. They used spice the way we still do, to make a meal feel like more than a necessity. They used spice the way we still do, to make a meal feel like more than a necessity. And then, when the dishes were cleared, when the bread crusts were brushed from tunics and the wine cups emptied, many of them did something we rarely credit them for. They got up and moved. Not just to the next village or across the field, not just for firewood or water or chapel, but miles. Dozens of them, hundreds in some cases. They walked, rode, sailed and trudged down roads we imagine they never saw. Because if there's one more myth that clings as stubbornly as any other, it's the idea that medieval people never left their birthplace. That the average person lived and died within 5 miles of where they were born, never glimpsing another horizon, never meeting a stranger, never venturing beyond their local mud and misery. But the real story is far more mobile. Let's start with the obvious: war. Europe during the Middle Ages was not a peaceful place. From feudal skirmishes to crusades, from border disputes to royal successions, conflict pulled people across vast distances. Kings needed armies needed bodies, and peasants, whether conscripted, hired or pressed into service, often found themselves marching hundreds of miles away from the fields they knew. They passed through cities they'd never imagined, camped near rivers they couldn't name, fought and fled and occasionally stayed. War displaced, but it also connected. Roads were widened. Camps became towns. Stories moved with soldiers, and so did languages, customs and goods. But travel wasn't only for the unwilling. Pilgrimage, for example, was a core part of medieval religious life. Ordinary men and women, driven by devotion, guilt, curiosity, or the hope of a miracle, undertook journeys that could last months or years. They walked to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, to Canterbury in England, to Rome, Cologne, or even Jerusalem. Along the way, they stopped at monasteries, shrines, and hostels. They collected pilgrimage badges, tokens that marked their progress and proved their devotion. Entire economies grew around these journeys: way stations, food vendors, bootmakers. Some towns existed almost solely to serve travellers on sacred roads. Merchants, too, were always on the move. Local markets were the heartbeat of medieval commerce, but regional and international fairs brought together buyers and sellers from across kingdoms. Flanders, Champagne, Venice. These were not backwaters. They were thriving, bustling centres of trade, where fabrics, spices, timber, glass and silver changed hands daily. A cloth weaver in a small village might send bolts of wool to Bruges or Genoa. A potter might pack his cart and spend weeks on the road travelling from fair to fair. And merchants didn't travel empty-handed. They brought news, letters, books and ideas. Students travelled. So did scribes, minstrels, masons and monks. Universities in Paris, Oxford and Bologna drew scholars from distant provinces to attend school, to teach, to debate, to join a religious order. All required leaving home. Monks undertook errands, exchanged texts, built alliances. Itinerant preachers, sometimes sanctioned and sometimes not, roamed countryside and town square alike. Even actors moved, performing morality plays, juggling, reciting poems, or telling tales for coin and shelter. And then there were those who travelled for law. Courts and assizes rotated. Legal disputes sometimes had to be carried to a different town. Royal messengers, tax collectors, census takers all roamed the land on official business. If you were summoned, you moved. If you were taxed, you might follow your complaint to the Lord's Hall. If your land was questioned, you might need to walk miles to find someone who remembered the last boundary stone. It's not that no one stayed put. Of course some did. Many did. The poor, the ill, the elderly. People without means, motivation or support often lived their whole lives within a narrow loop. But this wasn't because travel was forbidden. It was because it was difficult. Roads were muddy, weather was unforgiving, bandits were real. But difficulty isn't the same as impossibility. And for those with purpose, the journey was often made. Evidence of this movement is everywhere, if you know where to look. Pilgrimage badges have been unearthed in villages hundreds of miles from their point of origin. Coins minted in distant cities appear in rural marketplaces. Letters, written in one dialect, end up preserved in another, and legal records show witnesses appearing from far-off regions, summoned to speak, to defend, to swear or accuse. The logistics are messy, the pace is slow, but it happened. Even passports, in a sense, existed. Not the bound, laminated documents we know today, but letters of safe conduct. Sealed messages issued by lords, abbots or kings granting the bearer safe passage through particular lands. These were not luxuries, they were tools. Tools of trade, pilgrimage and diplomacy. To need one was to be on the road. To use one was to trust that the world, even with all its risks, was worth crossing. And what about the towns themselves? They weren't isolated islands. They were connected by trade routes, rivers and shared institutions. Feasts and festivals drew crowds from neighbouring villages. Fairs turned rural crossroads into temporary cities. Relics on tour, bones of saints, shrouds, nails, chalices, attracted thousands. Entire towns would swell and shrink depending on the season, the calendar, the political moment. Even during the plague years, people moved, some fleeing, others returning, many simply hoping. And yet the myth remains that medieval life was static, that people never wandered more than 5 miles. The origin of that number is murky. It may come from demographic studies, from average land holdings, or from a misreading of parish boundaries. But wherever it came from, it's lodged itself in public memory. Easy to remember, hard to correct. But it should be corrected, because mobility was part of life. Limited, yes. Uneven, dangerous, but real. The idea of the closed village, untouched by the outside world, is a fantasy, or more accurately, a reflection of how modern historians once saw peasants, as interchangeable, immobile, voiceless. But even the poorest people had kin in other towns. They married across borders. They took jobs elsewhere. They joined armies, fled feuds, followed rumours, and sometimes simply left because they could. The world was wider than we think, and people, even then, found ways to explore it. The world was wider than we think, and people, even then, found ways to explore it. But even as they crossed borders, followed trade routes, and climbed muddy roads to far-off shrines, they still carried the same burdens we do. Pain, injury, illness, and the unrelenting need to understand what was happening inside their bodies when things went wrong. The common image of medieval medicine is one of dark alleys and dirty knives, of leeches on skin, of charlatans muttering incantations while waving herbs and bleeding patients dry. And to be fair, some of that happened. But the deeper truth is more complex, because beneath the superstition, the guesswork, and the bloodletting, there was also structure, curiosity, and even innovation. Start with the basics. The idea that medieval people relied entirely on spiritual healing, or that they were too primitive to attempt real surgery, is simply false. Across Europe and the Islamic world, physicians, surgeons, midwives, apothecaries, and herbalists worked within a framework of knowledge inherited from Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources. They didn't understand bacteria, but they understood infection. They didn't know about viruses, but they noticed patterns. They studied the human body through observation, texts, and sometimes through direct experience. Anatomical dissection, while controversial, did occur in select universities by the 14th century. Surgeons in the Middle Ages could remove cataracts, set bones, lance abscesses, extract bladder stones, and amputate limbs when necessary. They knew how to stitch wounds with silk, how to dress injuries with honey and wine, both of which had antibacterial properties. They practiced trepanation, drilling holes into the skull, to relieve pressure after trauma, an operation documented for centuries and performed with surprising success. The patients who survived were not just lucky, they were treated by practitioners who understood the basics of wound care, cleanliness, and timing. And they weren't doing it in back alleys. Monasteries often operated infirmaries, caring not just for their own, but for travellers, pilgrims, and the local poor. These monastic hospitals were clean by the standards of the day. Beds were spaced, linens were changed, water was heated. Herbal gardens provided ingredients for poultices, teas, and tinctures. The Benedictines in particular emphasized care as a religious duty, hospitality not just for the soul, but for the body. Urban hospitals also developed, especially by the 13th century. In cities like Paris, London, and Milan, institutions emerged that bore some resemblance to the hospitals we know now, places with beds, wards, staff, and protocols. They weren't always effective, and they couldn't cure much, but they offered structure, a place to rest, a place to die, a place sometimes to recover. And contrary to the idea that the barber surgeon was a joke, a man who cut hair in the morning and legs in the afternoon, these practitioners had skills. Often trained through apprenticeship, they understood blood vessels, muscle tension, and practical anatomy. They knew how to cauterize a wound with hot iron or boiling oil, not out of cruelty, but to save a life. They stitched, drained, braced, and cleaned. Some even kept notes. What they lacked was consistency. Medicine wasn't standardized. A woman in one town might trust a herbalist who swore by mugwort and garlic. In another, A monk might prescribe prayers and fasting. Elsewhere, a Jewish physician trained in Arabic texts might offer a completely different diagnosis. There were guilds and licenses in some places, but not all. Quacks existed, of course. Snake oil salesmen are not a modern invention. But so did thoughtful, careful practitioners doing their best with what little they had. And what they had wasn't always so little. The medical texts that circulated in the Middle Ages, many translated from Arabic, originally from Greek or Persian, were often encyclopedic in scope. Works like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, Galen's treatises, and texts from Salerno and Montpellier offered detailed discussions of symptoms, treatments, and even surgical techniques. These weren't fringe documents. They were used, studied, copied, and argued over. Of course, the lens through which they viewed the body was different. Much of it revolved around the theory of humours. 4 bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, whose balance determined health. It sounds laughable now, but it was a system, one that tried to explain fevers, moods, digestion, and disease. Within that framework, treatments were tailored, not randomly, but based on observation. A hot, dry illness called for cool, moist remedies. A sluggish patient might be given bitter herbs. A bloody nose might be seen as the body correcting its own imbalance. And yes, there was bloodletting, but even this wasn't always reckless. It was done according to charts that mapped the body's meridians and the moon's phases, designed to minimize harm. It didn't always help, and often it hurt, but it was rooted in the science of the time, not in madness. Anesthesia? Not modern, but not absent. Sleeping potions made from hemlock, mandrake, opium, or henbane were known. Dangerous, certainly, but they dulled pain when the risk of surgery outweighed the risk of the drug. Bandages were made from linen soaked in vinegar, wine, or honey. Some were sprinkled with dried herbs. Surgeons knew that cleanliness mattered, not in the microscopic way we know it, but in the visible sense. Dirty tools caused more deaths. Wounds left open too long festered. Patterns mattered and they noticed them. And then there's the matter of birth. Midwives were everywhere. Women trained through generations of hands-on experience. They guided births, turned breech babies, delivered afterbirth, and tended to mothers in ways many male physicians never dared. Some were respected. Others, tragically, accused of witchcraft when things went wrong. But their knowledge was vast, from soothing teas to herbal compresses to the calm voice in the storm of labour. It wasn't sterile, it wasn't safe, but it was practiced, again and again, with deep care. The biggest myth of medieval medicine isn't that it was violent or gross, it's that it was foolish. That no one knew anything. That they groped blindly in the dark. But they didn't. They studied, they watched, they compared, they tried. And above all, they cared. Not always successfully, not without mistakes, but with more thought and structure than most of us ever imagined. They didn't have stethoscopes or antibiotics, but they had charts, case books, healing hands, and the stubborn belief that bodies could be mended. And that's worth remembering. The next time someone scoffs about leeches or laughs about holes drilled in skulls. Because the truth is, they didn't sit back and accept pain. They fought it with everything they had. They fought it with everything they had. And often, among those fighting, healing, building and remembering were women. Women whose names may not have survived, but whose work did. Women who have, for centuries, been flattened into a single, silent silhouette. The powerless medieval wife, the obedient daughter, the draped and downcast figure in the background of a tapestry. It's an image we rarely question, one of soft edges and quiet mouths. But it was never that simple. The truth is that women were threaded into the very structure of medieval society. They weren't always loud, and they weren't always free, but they were present, working, ruling, speaking, deciding. Not in every room, not with every right, but in ways that don't fit neatly into our assumptions. At the top of the social ladder stood queens and noblewomen. These were not just ceremonial titles. A medieval queen consort often ruled in her husband's absence. She issued decrees, raised armies, negotiated marriages, and secured peace treaties. Some even governed entire realms as regents when kings died young or went off to war. Blanche of Castile ruled France while her son was still a boy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a duchess in her own right, commanded lands across France and England, led a crusade, and patronised poets and thinkers. These were not quiet figures. They were political actors with their own courts, allies, and agendas. Even further from the throne, noble women managed estates that rivaled small towns. When their husbands were away or dead, they handled harvests, collected rents, oversaw justice among tenants, and managed domestic staff. Records show them corresponding with lawyers, hiring workers, and enforcing contracts. In many cases, they were better educated than their husbands, particularly in Latin, arithmetic, and estate management, the tools required to keep a household of 50 or more running in the middle of a turbulent world. But this wasn't just a story of castles and crowns. In the towns and cities, women worked, period. They brewed ale, ran inns, made cloth, sold herbs, kept shops, stitched garments, baked bread, raised animals, and treated the sick. Some were midwives, some were weavers, some were scribes. In port cities and market towns, women appeared in tax records, guild rolls, court disputes, and business contracts. They weren't just helping, they were leading. All female guilds existed in certain trades. In Paris, silk workers formed their own female-run confraternities. In London, widows often inherited their husband's trade licence and continued operations under their own name. A woman might not have been allowed to vote in town councils, but she could still make a living, train apprentices, and become known for her craft. Many cities had laws protecting a woman's right to keep her tools or her dowry in the event of divorce. And while the laws often favoured men, women knew how to use them, to contest claims, to sue, to negotiate. And they were not strangers to literacy. While male monastics often received formal education, many elite women learned to read as well. Noble daughters were taught to manage correspondence, read devotional texts, and sometimes even compose verse or keep records. In convents, women copied manuscripts, preserved histories, and translated religious texts. Hildegard of Bingen wrote on everything from medicine to music to theology, corresponding with popes and emperors. Her works were not marginal, they were foundational. Partial literacy was also more common than we give credit for. A woman might not read fluently, but she could recognize key words, signs, or numbers, enough to identify her property, interpret a recipe, track expenses, or understand a letter dictated aloud. Illiterate did not always mean unaware. In the countryside, where most people lived, the picture changes, but the presence remains. Peasant women worked side by side with men in the fields. They planted, harvested, herded, and hauled. They also ran households, baking, spinning, preserving, nursing, and managing children, often with no help but their own mother or daughter. During times of war, plague, or famine, when men were conscripted or killed, it was women who kept things going, not by stepping in, but by already being there. And yet they were still vulnerable. Childbirth was dangerous. Legal rights were limited. A woman's property could be absorbed by her husband's family. Her testimony might be worth less in court. She could be punished for speaking too boldly, for dressing above her station, for stepping out of line. The church taught obedience and purity, and sermons often reinforced a woman's lower place. But even here, things were not monolithic. Some religious orders allowed women significant freedom. Nuns could become powerful abbesses, managing land, money, and politics. Anchorites, women who chose to live sealed in small cells attached to churches, became spiritual advisors to kings and commoners alike. Their words carried weight, even when their bodies were confined. And in the courts of public opinion, women fought back. They filed legal complaints. They gathered witnesses. They ran away from violent husbands. They negotiated dowries. They resisted forced marriages. They went to court not just as defendants, but as plaintiffs, as witnesses, as creditors. They weren't always believed, they weren't always safe, but they were there, and they laughed, they joked, they told stories. They passed down songs and proverbs, patched stories into quilts and prayers into bread. They braided their daughters' hair while warning them about untrustworthy boys. They whispered secrets at the well. They shaped the moral backbone of villages and the private habits of nobles. They were, as ever, the memory keepers. The myth of the silent medieval woman, always obedient, always passive, erases more than it reveals. It turns living people into shadows. But in every guild roll, every legal dispute, every surviving recipe or letter or contract signed with a careful mark, you can hear the rustle of sleeves, the quiet grit of stubbornness. They didn't have the same freedoms we expect now, but they weren't absent, they weren't mute. They lived within their world, and they shaped it. They lived within their world, and they shaped it. Not just in palaces and parish records, but in markets, workshops, convents, and corners of the world where formal power rarely reached, but practical authority thrived. For centuries, the assumption has been that medieval women stood on the periphery, tolerated but rarely central. And yet when you look more closely at the fabric of everyday life, it's hard to ignore how tightly their hands were woven into every seam. Take the guilds. In many towns across Europe, guilds governed the trades, setting prices, training apprentices, settling disputes, and maintaining quality. While some were exclusively male, others included women as full members, especially in crafts where women had long worked alongside their husbands or fathers. In cities like Paris and Cologne, all-female guilds emerged in industries like silk weaving, embroidery, brewing, and even money-lending. These weren't underground efforts. They were legal, recognised, and often respected, though not always without friction. In some cases, widows inherited their husband's membership and carried the business forward, not as caretakers, but as active participants. They hired staff, managed accounts, ordered supplies, and made decisions. Some were eventually allowed to train their own apprentices, passing the trade down through daughters or nieces, and these weren't rare exceptions. Records show dozens, even hundreds of such women, not tucked away in attics but hammering, spinning, dyeing and writing contracts. Their shops stood in public markets. Their names appeared in court rolls and tax ledgers. They paid their dues, they kept the trade alive, and they weren't all middle class. In smaller towns, the line between domestic labour and economic labour was thin. A woman baking bread for her family might bake extra loaves for neighbours. A spinner making wool for her household might take in fibres from others. Over time, those side efforts could evolve into full businesses. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer, were common in England. They dominated the trade for centuries before commercial brewing became centralised. These women handled the boiling, fermenting, measuring and selling. They kept shops, dealt with customers, and even navigated inspection by local ale tasters, officials charged with quality control. Some earned reputations for honesty and flavour. Others, often unfairly, became targets of ridicule and suspicion when business failed or politics changed. But business wasn't their only arena. In religious life, women often found influence through spiritual roles. Convents were more than sanctuaries, they were intellectual hubs. In some cases, they operated like female-run universities, with libraries, scriptoriums, and schools attached. Nuns studied theology, music, medicine, and astronomy. They taught local girls, copied manuscripts, and advised patrons. Some became spiritual counselors to the powerful, writing letters, interpreting visions, shaping the tone of public prayer. Abbesses held legal authority over lands, vassals, and income. They managed farms, collected rents, presided over tenants. The head of a major convent might control more property than a minor nobleman. In some regions, abbesses even had seats in local governing bodies, where they voiced opinions on legal disputes and land usage. Their role was not ornamental. It was administrative, spiritual, and deeply political, and their influence extended beyond church walls. Women took part in charitable networks, caring for the sick, feeding the poor, housing travellers. Hospitals, leper houses, and almshouses often relied on female labour, sometimes organised through religious confraternities. Wealthy women, both secular and religious, endowed chapels, funded repairs, and sponsored masses for the dead. Their names were carved into stone, their donations remembered in liturgical calendars. Quiet power, perhaps, but power all the same. In the legal realm, women were not always silenced. They could sue and be sued. They could inherit property under specific conditions. They could serve as witnesses, though their testimony was sometimes discounted or limited depending on the court. In some regions, customary law granted daughters equal inheritance when no sons existed. In others, widows had claim to a third of their husband's estate, the dower, a vital safeguard in times when remarriage wasn't guaranteed, and they used these rights. Records from town courts and manorial rolls show women filing complaints, contesting debts, demanding payment for goods or services. They challenged neighbours over fences and livestock, disputed wills, and defended their reputations. When slander threatened their social standing, they took accusers to court. When landlords encroached on customary rights, they stood with other tenants to resist. These women weren't always educated in law, but they understood the stakes. They learned the system. They played it as best they could. Even in the home, that so-called natural domain, their role was strategic. Managing a household required budgeting, storing food across seasons, tending to illnesses, educating children, preparing textiles, hosting guests, and overseeing servants or labourers if the family had any. A woman in charge of a home wasn't simply maintaining comfort. She was running an enterprise. One mistake, a spoiled barrel of grain, a poorly timed slaughter, an undried herb rack could cost a family dearly. And in communities where survival depended on mutual labour, competence meant everything. But all of this came with tension. For every woman who found a foothold, there were structures trying to push her back. Theologians argued over her place. Preachers warned of her danger. Popular literature overflowed with tropes. The nagging wife, the gossiping neighbour, the seductive widow. Humour and suspicion mixed freely. A woman who succeeded too visibly might be mocked, ostracised, or accused. Respect existed, but it was often conditional, and the line between admiration and accusation was thin. Even so, they persisted. Some by marrying well, others by working hard. Some by keeping their heads down, others by stepping forward when needed. Some wrote, some sang, some simply endured. Their stories weren't always grand or tragic, often just practical. A bread maker who kept the shop open after her husband died. A nun who taught a girl to read. A midwife who remembered what herbs worked best for each kind of pain. These weren't background characters, they were the continuity, the daily rhythm that kept communities alive. And when we reduce them to silence, we lose not just their words, but their wisdom. Because they were not static, they were not footnotes. They were active, adaptive, aware, as vital to the shape of the medieval world as any crown, sword, or sermon. They were active, adaptive, aware, as vital to the shape of the medieval world as any crown, sword, or sermon. And right alongside them, occupying just as much space in the public imagination, though perhaps not always in truth, were the knights, gleaming in plate armour, charging into battle, protecting the weak, and living by codes of chivalry that read more like poetry than policy. For generations, the image of the medieval knight has been kept alive in everything from fairy tales to fantasy novels. A lone figure, noble and grim, bound by honour, swinging swords in the name of justice. But just like the myths that oversimplify women, peasants, or medicine, this version of knighthood demands a closer look. Because medieval knights weren't just fighters, they were brands. Tournaments were their stage. Not the polite, fenced duels you might imagine, but roaring public events where knights competed in front of crowds of thousands. There were parades, music, banners, and betting. Spectators placed wagers. Vendors sold food. Scribes recorded the outcomes. These contests could last for days, and ranged from individual jousts to chaotic melee battles that more closely resembled organised brawls than anything from a romance poem. But even in the dust and noise, everything was performance. Armour wasn't just for protection. It was designed to be seen. Shields were painted with personal heraldry. Crests rose from helmets in elaborate shapes. Wings, horns, feathers. each a visual claim to identity, legacy, and style. Capes and surcoats were embroidered with family symbols. Horse armor shimmered with silk and gold thread. Knights didn't want to blend in. They wanted to be noticed. And they were. Chroniclers followed them. Poets wrote verses about their deeds. Some knights hired writers to document their lives. Early PR campaigns, carefully curated to spread tales of valor and virtue. These texts travelled, were copied, read aloud in courts and taverns. A knight's reputation often spread far beyond his actual experience, and maintaining that image was crucial. A dull knight might win a fight. A famous one might win patronage. Tournaments weren't just sport. They were career advancement. Kings and lords watched closely. A successful performance might lead to an invitation to court, a marriage alliance, a land grant, or even military command. Some knights spent more time travelling from tourney to tourney than they ever did on a battlefield, and many treated their armour the way modern athletes treat endorsements, as investments, as expressions, as statements. But fame came with risk. Injuries were common, deaths not unheard of. A broken lance could shatter a jaw. A crushed helmet could crack a skull. Yet the rewards were tempting enough to draw crowds of young men from noble families eager to earn renown. Training began in boyhood, as pages, then squires. By the time they became knights, they had years of conditioning, training, etiquette, and expectation behind them. The chivalric code, often quoted with such reverence, was more aspiration than law. It spoke of loyalty, honour, piety, and defence of the weak. But real knights were messy. Some were brutal. Others were vain. Many were deeply political. They broke promises, ignored oaths, and pursued wealth just as eagerly as glory. And the weak they were supposed to defend. Especially peasants and townsfolk were often the first casualties when knights needed food, lodging, or a place to quarter troops. Still, the code mattered. It shaped behaviour. It offered a framework, however uneven, for how a knight should act, and some did try to live by it. Others just wanted to be seen trying. Chivalric literature exploded during the High Middle Ages. Arthurian legends, chansons de geste, courtly romances. These weren't instructional manuals. They were cultural scripts, shaping expectations, desires, and dreams. And the audiences were wide. Knights read them, yes, but so did ladies, clergy, merchants. The tales were copied by monks, adapted by playwrights, and retold by travelling performers. They influenced fashion, speech, even court etiquette. Kings referenced them, queens commissioned them. Knights tried to live up to them, and sometimes died trying. Beneath the glamour, though, knighthood was expensive. Armour, weapons, horses, servants, all costly. A knight needed wealth or a sponsor. Some relied on family fortunes. Others depended on patrons, kings, dukes, or wealthy lords who provided resources in exchange for loyalty. And just like modern sponsorships, the relationship was transactional. A knight served, a patron paid. The arrangement worked, until it didn't. When wars broke out, the role shifted. Knights formed the core of elite cavalry units. They fought in pitched battles, sieges, and raids. Their training mattered. So did their armour. But war, unlike tournaments, wasn't staged. It was chaotic, lethal, unpredictable. The same man who dazzled crowds in silk-covered armour might be unhorsed by a low-ranking foot soldier with a spear. By the late Middle Ages, as weapons improved and warfare changed, knights became less dominant on the battlefield. Longbows, pikes, and later firearms made heavy cavalry vulnerable. Infantry gained importance. But knighthood didn't disappear. It evolved. The title became more symbolic, tied to service, honour, and ritual. It lingered in ceremony long after it faded from military primacy. And through it all, the image endured, not just in books, but in public consciousness. The knight as hero, the knight as protector, the knight as flawless ideal. And like all enduring images, it required selective memory. Forget the political manoeuvring, the violent raids, the vanity. Remember only the sword raised high, the shield lifted in defence, the banner flapping nobly in the wind. But if you look closer, the story shifts. You see the performance, the marketing, the hustle. You see a young man borrowing coin to pay for a new surcoat, hoping it'll catch a noble's eye. You see a bruised jaw beneath the helmet. You see the chronicler sharpening a tale to make it more palatable. You see knights as they were, ambitious, flawed, theatrical, human. They weren't the stoic guardians of Hollywood lore. They were closer to influences, curated, branded, dramatic, and very aware of the gaze upon them. And just as the knights were not the stoic paragons we were sold, the peasants were not the silent masses we've so often imagined them to be. History has a way of flattening people who don't leave behind glittering manuscripts or marble tombs. And in the case of medieval peasants, it often flattens them into caricatures, bent-backed, obedient, shuffling through mud with their heads bowed, submissive, helpless, silent. But if you take the time to read the margins of court records, tax rolls, and scribbled complaints from irritated landowners, you'll find a very different story. You'll find resistance, protest, defiance. The truth is, the medieval lower classes weren't just passive recipients of feudal cruelty. They negotiated, organized, resisted, and, when pushed hard enough, they revolted. And these weren't random acts of desperation. These were coordinated, intentional movements with clear demands and collective voices. If knights were influencers, peasants were organizers. Their tools were different, not armor and lances, but petitions, refusals, sabotage, and sometimes pitchforks. Let's take the Peasants' Revolt of 38-1 in England. Often brushed aside as an isolated tantrum of the lower classes, it was, in reality, a massive uprising rooted in systemic frustration. Decades of high taxation, war levies, labour restrictions, and inflation had strained the already fragile existence of the peasantry. Then came the Black Death, wiping out nearly half the population. With labour now scarce, peasants expected better wages and greater mobility. But Parliament, eager to stabilise the old order, imposed laws like the Statute of Labourers, freezing wages and binding workers to their manners. Resentment simmered. Then came the spark, a poll tax levied in 3080. It wasn't just the amount, it was the principle. Everyone was taxed equally regardless of income, and tax collectors were ruthless. When one official attempted to grope a young girl under the guise of verification, her village retaliated. Word spread, and within days, thousands of men and women were marching on London, demanding justice. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by preachers like John Ball, who questioned the divine right of lords and proclaimed, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman," the revolt became more than economic. It was ideological. They wanted an end to serfdom, to feudal obligations, to the inherited tyranny of a system that treated them like livestock. They stormed the Tower of London, executed officials, demanded reforms. For a brief, trembling moment, it seemed the social order might break. King Richard II met with the rebels. He promised amnesty and reform. Wat Tyler was killed shortly after, under suspicious circumstances, and the movement fractured. The promises were revoked. The repression was swift, but the memory lingered. It shook the nobility. It made clear that peasants were watching, thinking, organising, and that silence did not mean submission. And England was not unique. Across Europe, similar uprisings erupted. The Jacquerie in France in 1358, named after the derogatory term Jacques for peasants, saw thousands rise against nobles, burning estates, freeing prisoners, tearing down symbols of aristocratic control. Though brutally crushed, it revealed the volatility under the surface of supposed obedience. In Flanders, textile workers staged strikes and organised councils to demand fair wages and humane hours. In the German states, rural communities formed leagues, wrote demands, and sometimes even armed themselves against local lords. And while many of these efforts were quelled, often with bloody reprisals, they left behind a trail of petitions, charters, and small legal victories. Step by step, they pushed back. Not all resistance was so explosive. Much of it was quieter, but no less intentional. A family might hide a pig from the manorial steward to avoid taxes. A tenant might underreport crop yields, or abandon their plot and flee to a nearby town. Women refused to name fathers of children in bastardy courts, protecting partners or refusing to feed the system. Villagers delayed giving grain tithes to the church, or collectively complained when a new priest arrived with too many demands. These were not accidents, they were choices. Customary law gave peasants more leverage than we often assume. Though lords claimed wide rights, the relationship was transactional. A tenant owed service, but only if certain obligations were met. If a lord changed terms without consent, withheld grazing rights, or pushed too hard on rents, he risked revolt or collective refusal. Villagers knew their rights. They cited them. They used memory and the fear of collective action as tools. Community was their strength. Even the poorest cottager wasn't alone. Villagers held meetings, elected reeves, shared tools, and defended each other. When a lord tried to enclose common lands, villagers might band together to tear down fences overnight, a silent warning. If a bailiff grew too cruel, he might find his path blocked, his horse lamed, his windows shattered. It wasn't just rage, it was communication. And they used culture too. Songs, stories, riddles, all carried critiques of power. Ballads mocked greedy landlords. Folk tales twisted the sins of the rich into moral lessons. A woman might sing while spinning, weaving in satire that her lord wouldn't understand. A peasant boy might carve a rude gesture onto the wall of the tithe barn. Resistance was everywhere, if you looked closely enough. What we call peasants encompassed a range of people, some barely surviving, others reasonably secure. Some owned land, some rented, some moved from town to town seeking day labour. But what united them wasn't just poverty, it was exclusion. They were told their suffering was ordained, by God, by birth, by fate. That obedience was holy, that rebellion was sin. But time and again they proved otherwise, not by toppling empires, but by demanding to be seen, by breaking rules, whispering songs, storming gates, and planting seeds of doubt in systems that claimed permanence. And that's what makes their story so powerful, not because they always won, but because they dared. They remind us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's whispered by the many, in fields, in courts, in fires lit just out of sight. If you ask most people what medicine was like in the Middle Ages, you'll get one of two answers, either a snorting dismissal, something about leeches and prayers, or a gory tale of bloodletting and bone saws wielded by dirty hands in a candlelit cellar. And yes, both happened. But to define 1,000 years of medical practice by its worst anecdotes is like judging modern science by homeopathy and TikTok detox scams. The reality was far more complex. Medieval medicine wasn't primitive ignorance. It was a sophisticated, evolving body of knowledge, rooted in ancient texts, enriched by observation and carried forward by countless hands, many of them women's. At the heart of medieval health was the humoral theory, inherited from the Greek physician Galen and reinforced by Arabic scholars like Avicenna. It divided the body into 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each associated with elements, seasons, temperaments. Health was balance. Illness was imbalance. Treatments aimed to restore harmony, not attack symptoms. And though that framework sounds outdated, it wasn't illogical. It reflected an attempt to systematize disease, to read the body like a map, and apply reason to its mysteries. Doctors didn't operate in ignorance, they studied. Universities from Salerno to Paris to Bologna offered formal medical training by the 12th century. Students read Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and Aristotle. They debated theory, they took exams, and they practiced under supervision before becoming physicians. Medical schools flourished, especially in southern Europe, where cross-cultural exchange with Islamic medicine brought in texts, instruments, and surgical techniques that the Latin West had long forgotten. And it wasn't just theory. Medieval doctors observed their patients. They examined urine colour and consistency, noted pulse changes, checked stool, tracked fevers. They kept casebooks. They recorded treatments. They modified prescriptions. A good physician didn't simply recite. He watched, he listened, he adapted. And when treatments failed, they didn't shrug. They tried something else. Surgery, often dismissed as butchery, was its own discipline, practiced by trained barber surgeons, often more pragmatic than their scholarly counterparts. They drained abscesses, set fractures, cauterized wounds, removed bladder stones, and even conducted cranial trepanations. Instruments were cleaned with vinegar or wine. Wounds were packed with honey, or herbs known for antimicrobial properties. Books like Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac detailed surgical anatomy, pain management, and post-operative care. Yes, anesthesia was rudimentary. Yes, infection rates were high. But these surgeons weren't reckless. They studied pain. They prioritized speed. They recognized risk. And their tools weren't crude clubs. They were scalpels, forceps, needles, and saws shaped with care, stored with reverence. But perhaps the most overlooked healers were women. While university medicine was male-dominated, everyday health care was largely in their hands. Midwives, herbalists, lay healers. They tended the sick, delivered babies, treated wounds, and managed nutrition. Many had generations of knowledge passed down orally. Some kept recipe books, called herbals, filled with detailed plant lore, dosage instructions, seasonal harvesting guides. Plants like yarrow, willow bark, foxglove, and juniper were used with precision and purpose. Female healers worked in monasteries, villages, noble households. They were respected until they weren't. By the 14th century, a growing suspicion of women's knowledge, especially if unsanctioned by male authority, turned many midwives and herbalists into targets. Accusations of witchcraft replaced admiration. Knowledge that had healed communities for centuries was suddenly suspect. But even within the church, medicine thrived. Monasteries served as early hospitals, hospitia, offering rest, care, and structured treatment. Monks kept medicinal gardens, brewed tinctures, and copied medical texts. They documented patient symptoms, treatments given, outcomes observed. The Benedictine rule even emphasized care for the sick as a sacred duty. And it wasn't just spiritual balm. They treated wounds, reduced fevers, and fed balanced diets. Medical manuals from the time show an impressive breadth of understanding. They described symptoms of diabetes, differentiated types of fevers, and even identified contagious diseases. Centuries before germ theory, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a widely circulated guide, offered advice on sleep, diet, exercise, and hygiene, promoting moderation, rest, and cleanliness in an era often imagined as filthy and fatalistic. Of course, superstition lingered. Astrology influenced diagnosis. Amulets were worn, prayers were said. But these weren't substitutes for treatment. They were additions. Medicine and faith coexisted. A patient might receive a poultice and a blessing. A doctor might consult the stars and the pulse. It wasn't either or, it was both. And medieval hospitals, not the crowded death traps of modern horror stories. Many were peaceful sanctuaries. Staffed by monks, nuns, and lay nurses, they provided food, baths, fresh linens, and attentive care. They weren't always curative. Few were, but they were humane. They treated the whole person. Some had dedicated wards for women. Others housed lepers or orphans. They were places of dignity, not abandonment. And yet the narrative persists that the Middle Ages were a time of medical darkness, a 1,000-year void between Hippocrates and penicillin. But this is modern arrogance masquerading as insight. Yes, many treatments failed. Yes, theories were flawed. But people were trying, earnestly, intelligently, creatively, to heal, to soothe, to understand. They mapped the stars and the gut. They recorded what worked and what didn't. They passed on knowledge. They built on what they had. And when the Renaissance came, it didn't start from scratch. It stood on their shoulders. Death was not a stranger in the Middle Ages. It was a companion. It visited early, often, and without mercy. It took infants in their cradles and kings in their castles. Plagues swept through towns. Childbirth remained perilous, and a simple wound could turn septic. But to mistake this familiarity with death for a kind of numbness, or worse, hysteria, is to misunderstand entirely how medieval people saw their place in the cosmos. They didn't obsess over death. They studied it. planned for it, prayed through it, and most of all, they tried to die well. The concept of a good death, or ars moriendi, the art of dying, emerged not from fear, but from faith. To die well wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about preparing the soul. Confession, final blessings, saying farewell, making peace. It was a process with steps, responsibilities, rituals, not just for the dying, but for everyone around them. Neighbours came to witness. Clergy offered guidance. Children learned the prayers. Death wasn't hidden behind hospital curtains. It was public, participatory, a moment of communal gravity. And this didn't begin with the Black Death, though that crisis certainly sharpened the contours. Even before the plague, there were manuals, often illustrated, guiding the faithful on what temptations might visit the deathbed: despair, pride, impatience, worldly attachment, and how to resist them with scripture, prayer, presence. These weren't clinical tools, they were spiritual maps, telling people how to navigate the end with dignity and direction. Burial, too, was more thoughtful than we often assume. Bodies were washed and dressed, not always in rags or plain cloth, but in their Sunday best, if the family could afford it. Rings might be placed on fingers, herbs in the shroud, candles lit along the way, processions wound through villages, not in silence but in chant. Bells tolled, neighbours joined, children walked with their families. It was not merely spectacle, it was memory in motion, a community marking its own continuity through the departure of one of its own. Graveyards weren't feared the way we fear them now. They were social spaces. Markets spilled over into them. Families picnicked beside tombstones. Churches rose at their centre. To be buried in sacred ground was not only an honour, it was a comfort. You were with your people. You were still part of things. Death didn't exile you. It relocated you. Tombstones bore not just names, but stories, riddles, prayers, sometimes warnings. One might read, "As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be." But these weren't threats. They were invitations, reminders. Death wasn't the end, just a doorway, and the living were meant to keep looking through it. In monasteries and cathedrals, charnel houses kept bones arranged with care. Skulls weren't hidden, they were stacked in geometric patterns reverently. The remains of the dead weren't garbage, they were sacred. They marked continuity, and in some places, bones were even painted, dressed, or accompanied by inscriptions that told passers-by to live rightly, not because death was looming, but because life was sacred. Art told these stories constantly. Mosaics showed death not as a monster, but as a skeleton dancing, inviting, grinning, gesturing. The danse macabre, or dance of death, was a favourite motif. Kings and peasants, clergy and merchants, all dancing with death, not to mock them, but to remind us all we share the same fate. That dance wasn't grotesque, it was democratic, and it called for humility, not panic. Children learned to pray for the dead. Names were read aloud in mass. Candles burned for souls in purgatory, not because they were feared, but because they were family. Medieval people didn't cut ties with the dead, they wove them into daily life. Ancestors weren't gone, they were simply elsewhere. And yes, there were superstitions. People buried the dead with coins for safe passage, or placed stones over graves to keep restless spirits still. But these didn't contradict religion. They existed beside it, as layers of meaning, as hedges against the unknown. Medieval faith was porous. It allowed space for wonder, doubt, symbol. A candle might carry a prayer, or it might ward off a ghost. Either way, it mattered. Even literature grappled with death in ways we rarely credit. Think of the Book of Marjorie Kempe, a medieval woman's spiritual autobiography that devotes whole chapters to weeping over Christ's suffering, not as melodrama, but as theological empathy. Or the Ankreen Wis, a guide for female recluses, that counsels women to meditate daily on their deaths, not in fear, but in discipline, as preparation. We forget that medieval theology wasn't just dogma, it was philosophy, and thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or Julian of Norwich spent pages contemplating death not as punishment, but as reunion. Julian wrote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That wasn't denial. It was defiance. A hope carved from hardship, forged in the heat of plagues and wars and loss. And still the poor were not forgotten. While aristocrats had marble effigies and gilded tombs, the common folk had each other. Villagers collected alms for widows. They held wakes, not just to mourn, but to feed, to remember, to affirm the bonds that death could not sever. Wakes weren't silent. They were full of laughter, drink, stories, life asserting itself. The dead were not discarded. They were remembered, named, prayed for, loved. Their presence lingered not in fear but in rhythm. Bells rang at the hour of death. Masses were said on anniversaries. Entire communities tuned their calendars to those who had gone before. We, the moderns, often hide death behind closed doors, clinical settings, euphemisms. But the medieval world walked with it, not because they were obsessed, because they were honest. And in their honesty they found peace, ceremony, community. They didn't fear death the way we do. They respected it. And in doing so, they lived more fully. In the shadow, yes, but also in the light. To believe the standard story, women in the Middle Ages existed in a state of silent obedience, veiled behind cloister walls or confined to the hearth, their voices swallowed by patriarchy and parchment alike. But peel back the dust of that myth, and the truth is more dynamic. Yes, it was a patriarchal society. Yes, power skewed toward men. But within those structures, women worked, wrote, healed, ruled, rebelled, and shaped the world around them. Their silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was strategy, and sometimes it was anything but silent. Start with work. Women in the medieval economy were not ornamental. They were bakers, brewers, clothmakers, midwives, innkeepers, and moneylenders. In towns, widows often inherited their husbands' businesses, and many ran them profitably, sometimes expanding them. The records of London's Guildhall show dozens of women merchants registering goods, paying dues, managing apprentices. Names like Alice de Bryanton, a 14th century furrier, or Juliana of Ypres, a cloth merchant, aren't exceptions. They're part of a forgotten norm. Even agriculture wasn't solely a man's domain. Peasant women worked the fields, threshed grain, tended livestock, and gathered herbs. Their labour wasn't supplemental. It was survival. And their knowledge of seasons, soils, seeds was critical. Some became stewards of land, managing small estates in their husband's absence, or even permanently. Manor court rolls list women presenting complaints, paying fines, enforcing leases. They weren't invisible, they were essential. And in healthcare, women dominated. Wives not only delivered babies, but managed postnatal care, advised on fertility, treated infections, and provided palliative care. Their practices were often handed down through generations. Apprenticeships in all but name. Herbal knowledge was deep, nuanced, and regionally adapted. The church both relied on and feared them. Some midwives were licensed, others were condemned as witches. The line between healer and heretic was not always drawn by outcomes, but by who claimed authority. Within religion, too, women shaped spiritual life in ways that defied simple categorization. Abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, led monastic communities, composed music, wrote theological texts, and corresponded with emperors. Hildegard wasn't a footnote. She was a philosopher, a doctor, a visionary whose writings remain studied today. And she wasn't alone. Female mystics, Julian of Norwich, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Marjorie Kempe, wrote spiritual autobiographies, recorded visions, and preached, with or without permission. Their experiences weren't marginal. They were theological contributions, daring, emotional, embodied. Women also played vital roles in education. Though barred from universities, many were literate, especially in noble or clerical households. Noble women commissioned manuscripts, managed libraries, and engaged in political correspondence. Christine de Pizan, a 15th century French writer, supported her family through her writing. Her Book of the City of Ladies is a proto-feminist defense of women's intelligence and moral worth, and it circulated widely. That it existed and that it was read should recalibrate how we view medieval literacy and authorship. Politics? Yes, even here. Queens and noblewomen didn't merely serve decorative functions. They negotiated treaties, raised armies, acted as regents, and governed vast estates. Eleanor of Aquitaine led a crusade, funded poets, and was a political player across 2 kingdoms. Isabella of France invaded England and deposed a king. These weren't anomalies. They were examples of how status, not simply gender, shaped agency. In court records, we find women suing for property, defending their rights, even accusing others of slander or assault. Their voices survive, terse but persistent, in Latin script and legal abbreviations. They show us women who weren't cowering, they were litigating. Marriage, often portrayed as a life sentence, was more complex. Yes, many women married young, and yes, their choices were limited. But some wielded considerable influence within households. The dowry system gave women economic leverage. Dower rights ensured widows had legal claims, and while love wasn't always the basis of marriage, affection and partnership were not absent. Letters, poetry, and wills reveal tenderness alongside duty. A husband might leave his wife not just land, but my best cloak, our shared books, the cup we drank from. These are not the relics of emotionless transactions. Sexuality, too, was more textured than prudish stereotypes suggest. Church doctrine emphasized chastity, yes, but it also spoke of mutual consent, marital pleasure, and even women's right to refuse unwanted advances. The penitentials, guides for confessors, discuss female desire, sexual sins, and even same-sex relations, not always with condemnation, but with surprising specificity. That women's sexual agency was regulated doesn't mean it didn't exist. On the contrary, regulation implies recognition. The myth of the medieval woman as passive, powerless, and pious is a modern construction, one that flattens a spectrum of lived experience into a morality play. It ignores the abbess writing letters to popes, the merchant woman weighing spices, the healer distilling rosemary, the peasant mother sowing barley, the girl reading psalms by candlelight. These lives mattered. They moved history, and they were not voiceless. We just stopped listening. While some medieval women held quills or crowns, others stood at the edge of fire pits, not as witches, but as warnings. That's the paradox of the age. It could lift women into sanctity or sovereignty, but it could also turn their agency into threat. A midwife, once revered for delivering life, could be accused of bringing death. A literate woman, instead of being honoured, might be condemned as unnatural. The same society that worshipped the Virgin could also try to silence her daughters. Take the rise of witch hunts. Though they peaked later, in the early modern period, the seeds were sown earlier. Superstition was nothing new, but increasingly, healing knowledge passed from mother to daughter began to clash with the Church's growing monopoly on medicine and moral authority. Herbalists who knew how to ease childbirth pains or soothe fevers were sometimes branded suspicious, especially if their patients died or if the healer was poor, widowed, or simply disliked. Accusation became a weapon of social control, and women, especially older ones, were easy targets. This didn't come from nowhere. Cultural anxiety about female power ran deep. Even in theology, women's bodies were often painted as sites of temptation. Think of Eve, blamed for the fall, her legacy shadowing all who came after, or of medieval sermons warning men against the nagging tongue, the uncovered hair, the lustful glance. These weren't just metaphors. They were scripts that filtered down into law and life, and yet, in contradiction, some women wielded enormous institutional power. Abbesses like Hilda of Whitby oversaw double monasteries, communities of both monks and nuns. They managed lands, advised kings, and presided over religious councils. Hilda herself hosted the Synod of Whitby, helping decide the future of English Christianity. That's not a footnote in someone else's story. That's leadership. And it complicates any claim that the Church was entirely hostile to female authority. It wasn't. It simply sought to contain and control it. Queens, too, walked the same double-edged sword. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, wasn't content to remain in the shadows. She raised an army, invaded England, and helped depose her husband. all while negotiating alliances, managing court politics, and protecting her son's claim to the throne. Yet her legacy remains tangled. Where a king might be called bold, Isabella is labelled she-wolf. Her ambition, her strategy, her rebellion, all filtered through a lens that mistrusts female power when it steps beyond bounds. The same is true for women like Joan of Arc. Illiterate, young, and of peasant birth, Joan claimed divine visions, led armies, and altered the course of the 100 Years' War. But once her usefulness expired, she was captured, tried, and burned, not for treason, but for wearing men's clothes. That detail mattered. It symbolized her refusal to accept her assigned place. Heresy, they called it, but the real offense was her defiance of gender expectations. The Church rehabilitated her decades later. Centuries after that, she became a saint, but the flames had already done their work. Even women who conformed still faced scrutiny. Nuns who wrote too eloquently might be accused of pride. Widows who remarried too quickly risked gossip. Young girls who laughed too freely became subjects of rumour. Female virtue wasn't just encouraged, it was surveilled. And the ideal woman wasn't a thinker or a leader or even a worker. She was a concept, modest, silent, fertile, obedient. Anything outside that frame, whether by choice or by circumstance, became suspicious. But women pushed against these limits in ways both quiet and loud. Letters survive of wives chastising husbands for infidelity, mothers arranging inheritances, sisters challenging monastery rules. These aren't isolated cases. They're traces of resilience, of individuals navigating a world that tried to define them narrowly, yet could never fully contain them. And literature, ever the mirror of its age, reveals both the reverence and resentment aimed at women. In courtly romances, ladies are adored, but only if they remain aloof, pure, unattainable. In fabliaux, they're mocked, as schemers, gossips, seductresses. And in saints' lives, they're elevated. Virginity, martyrdom, miraculous endurance, these were the currencies of spiritual authority. Power, but only through pain. Even language betrayed this ambivalence. The same Latin root, virtus, gave us virtue and virility. Marilexcellence was coded male, and when women were praised for being virtuous, it often meant chaste, not courageous. Meanwhile, boldness in a man was heroic. In a woman, it was dangerous. And yet, despite all this, or perhaps because of it, medieval women found ways to endure, to adapt, to thrive. Some turned domestic spaces into sites of agency. A weaving loom could be a tool of income. A kitchen could double as an apothecary. Some found freedom in widowhood, unshackled from marital expectations. Others embraced religious life, not just out of piety, but as a path to education, autonomy, and authority. Stories weren't always written down, but they were lived, in songs hummed at spinning wheels, in recipes passed across generations, in the margins of manuscripts where a woman might add her name, in wills that named daughters, not just sons, in prayers whispered over herbs, in footprints worn into the floors of chapels. They weren't silent. We simply haven't always heard them. We simply haven't always heard them. And perhaps nowhere is that silence more telling than in how medieval people handled the body itself, its fluids, its appetites, its cycles of purity and pollution. To us, the Middle Ages are painted as prudish, repressed, chained by religion and superstition, with priests breathing down everyone's neck and villagers trembling over every bodily function. But the reality was stranger, subtler, and far more layered. Because medieval morality wasn't just about control, it was about negotiation between flesh and spirit, between law and custom, between shame and necessity. Take the idea of purity. It wasn't simply metaphorical, it was physical, lived, enforced. Menstruation, for example, carried heavy stigma. Theologians argued that menstrual blood was impure, dangerous, even poisonous. Medieval medical texts suggested it could wilt crops, kill bees, and spoil wine. Some even claimed it caused rabid dogs. And yet, women menstruated. Every month, in every village, across every century. Families lived with it. Husbands, brothers, fathers knew it existed. It was whispered about, avoided, sometimes mocked. But it was also woven into the logic of life. Midwives understood cycles. Herbalists tracked them for fertility. Farmers linked them to lunar rhythms. Stigma and pragmatism lived side by side. Sexuality was another paradox. On the one hand, the church preached chastity, condemned fornication, and railed against adultery. Manuals for confessors catalogued every imaginable act in painstaking detail, prescribing penances ranging from fasting to pilgrimage. On the other hand, those very lists prove just how often such sins occurred. People had sex, before marriage, outside marriage, sometimes in ways that scandalized clergy. Court records are full of cases. Couples caught in barns, clerics accused of keeping concubines, villagers fined for illicit liaisons. If anything, the Middle Ages weren't sexless. They were obsessed with categorizing, punishing, and sometimes tacitly tolerating it. Prostitution, for instance, was not only widespread, but regulated. Many towns had designated brothel districts. City officials collected rent and taxes from sex workers. Clergy condemned them, yet municipal governments defended their existence as a necessary evil to protect respectable women. The hypocrisy was obvious even then, but it reveals a society grappling with reality, unable to eradicate desire, choosing instead to manage it. Food and fasting were also moral battlegrounds. Eating wasn't just sustenance, it was discipline. Gluttony ranked among the 7 deadly sins. Lent and other fasts reshaped entire calendars. Whole towns adjusted diets, substituting fish for meat, abstaining from dairy, curbing indulgence. And yet, loopholes flourished. In some places, beavers were declared fish, making their tails fair game during fasting. Wealthier households found ways to stretch rules with exotic ingredients, sweetened almond milk, or lavish fish pies. The poor, meanwhile, often fasted by necessity, their hunger less pious choice than forced circumstance. Cleanliness, too, was tangled in morality. Bathhouses once thrived, communal, lively, even festive. But as fears of sin and disease mounted, they were condemned as places of lust, filth, and contagion. Some closed, others went underground. Yet bathing at home continued. Parents washed children. Priests urged confession before communion, often paired with physical cleansing. The body wasn't just dirt to be scrubbed. It was a vessel to be prepared. Punishment reflected the same logic. Public shame, the stocks, the pillory, the cucking stool, wasn't about physical pain so much as moral theatre. A baker who sold bad bread might be paraded with a loaf around his neck. A gossiping woman might be dunked in a pond. These weren't random cruelties. They were performances meant to reinforce communal values, to make visible the invisible lines people weren't supposed to cross. The punishment stung, but the real weight was in the watching eyes of neighbours. And then there were taboos that seem almost alien to us. Bestiality was condemned harshly. Not only the offender, but often the animal, was executed, burned, or buried, as if to erase the shame entirely. Incest prohibitions stretched far beyond immediate family, encompassing distant cousins, in-laws, godparents. Breaking them could invalidate marriages, strip inheritances, or spark scandal. Even laughter had limits. Excessive mirth, especially in church, could be treated as a sin. Joy itself had to be moderated, lest it tip into disorder. But don't mistake these codes for universal obedience. People bent them, mocked them, found cracks in them. Carnival season, especially before Lent, turned rules upside down. Men dressed as women. Peasants mocked nobles. Priests were parodied. Excess was celebrated before restraint returned. These rituals weren't rebellion so much as release valves. Sanctioned misrule that allowed people to live with the pressure of constant regulation. The body, in the medieval world, was never just flesh. It was symbol, metaphor, battlefield. It bore the weight of theology and politics alike. A woman's hair wasn't just hair, it was temptation. A man's appetite wasn't just hunger, it was a measure of sin, sweat, blood, milk, semen. Every fluid was charged with meaning, debated in sermons, regulated in law. whispered about in gossip. And yet, beneath all the rules and rhetoric, people carried on. They ate, drank, laughed, loved, sweated, sinned, confessed, repeated. They weren't robots of religion. They were human beings navigating a dense web of codes that were sometimes oppressive, sometimes absurd, sometimes comforting. For every priest thundering about impurity, there was a mother soothing a child, a midwife mixing herbs, a couple stealing a kiss in the shadows of a barn. The myth of medieval obsession with purity and shame flattens this complexity. It imagines a society terrified of its own skin, paralyzed by fear of sin. But what really emerges is a society negotiating, imperfectly, often harshly, the same tensions we still live with. The push and pull between desire and discipline, the body as both joy and burden. And in that struggle, they built a culture as contradictory, colourful, and human as any other. Nowhere is that contradiction clearer than in the ways they pursued justice. For us, courts are supposed to be rational, evidence-driven, grounded in logic. For them, truth was something you could test not only with testimony, but with fire, water, iron, even the behaviour of animals. Their legal world wasn't just about law, it was about meaning. And that meant trials often looked more like theatre than modern justice. Consider the infamous animal trials. Yes, they happened, and more often than most people realise. A pig that killed a child might be tried in court, given a lawyer, heard before a judge, and then hanged in the village square. In one 15th century French case, a sow was sentenced to death, but her piglets were acquitted, because witnesses testified the little ones were too young to understand the crime. Cows, horses, dogs, even insects faced charges. Vineyards accused of harbouring destructive caterpillars sometimes petitioned bishops to excommunicate the pests. To us it sounds absurd. To them it was coherent. Justice applied to all of God's creatures, and punishment wasn't just about deterrence. It was about restoring order in a cosmic sense. Then there were the ordeals, rituals designed to let God reveal guilt or innocence. A suspect might carry hot iron, a set distance, plunge their hand into boiling water, or be cast into a river-bound hand and foot. If the burns healed clean, or if the accused floated instead of sinking, it was taken as divine judgment. These weren't casual stunts. They were solemn ceremonies, overseen by clergy, witnessed by entire communities. And surprisingly, not everyone failed. Records show acquittals, proof, to medieval minds, that God had spoken. By the 13th century, ordeals were phased out, replaced by jury trials and witness testimony. But the principle lingered. Truth wasn't just human, it was divine, revealed through signs and symbols. Even oaths carried weight beyond words. Swearing on a relic, a saint's bone, or a gospel book wasn't empty ritual, it was binding in the most cosmic sense. To break it risked not only social ruin, but eternal damnation. Justice was public. Punishment was spectacle. Stocks, pillories, whipping posts, all placed in town squares. A baker selling short loaves might be paraded with bread tied around his neck. A miller who cheated customers might be dunked in water. A thief could lose a hand. These punishments weren't only about pain. They were about shame, forcing communities to watch, remember, and reinforce the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. But it wasn't all cruelty. Mediation was common. Villagers often settled disputes through compromise before cases escalated. Restitution mattered. A fight that broke teeth might end with coin payments, not blood feuds. A broken fence might be repaired at shared expense. And in church courts, penance often replaced punishment. Fasting, pilgrimages, donations to the poor. Justice could be harsh, but it could also be pragmatic. Underlying all of it was a conviction that justice wasn't just human invention. It was woven into the fabric of creation. Even the smallest transgression, a stolen egg, a false oath, a shove in a tavern, echoed into eternity. Punishment restored balance, not just for the community, but for the cosmos. That's why rituals mattered so much. They weren't superstitions tacked onto law. They were the law. To us, medieval justice looks strange, even laughable, but to them it was coherent. trials, ordeals, animal prosecutions. These weren't evidence of ignorance. They were expressions of belief, a belief that the world was ordered, that nothing escaped divine scrutiny, that every act by man, beast, or nature carried meaning. They weren't irrational. They were consistent with their world, their faith, their fears, and in their consistency they reveal a truth we often forget. Justice is never just about facts. It's about stories we tell ourselves to make sense of fairness, guilt, and order. And theirs, however alien it seems, was no less human than ours. And theirs, however alien it seems, was no less human than ours. That humanity is stamped most clearly on what they left behind, their art, their words, their arguments. Yet here too myth and mockery have long clouded our view. Look at a medieval painting, and the modern instinct is often to laugh. The proportions are wrong, the face is stiff, the animals oddly shaped. A knight might look like a cardboard cutout, a lion more like a dog with a bad haircut. We call it childish, primitive, awkward. But what if we've misunderstood the point? Because medieval art wasn't failing at realism, it wasn't even trying. To them, art wasn't about replicating what the eye saw. It was about conveying what the soul knew. If Mary looks larger than the buildings around her, that's intentional. She is larger, spiritually, symbolically. If Christ glows with gold leaf, it's not because the artist couldn't manage shading. It's because divinity demanded brilliance beyond natural colour. Art was theology in pigment. It wasn't meant to trick the eye. It was meant to teach, to awe, to remind. Take stained glass windows. In cathedrals from Chartres to York, they weren't just decoration. They were books in light. Scenes of creation, crucifixion, martyrdoms, miracles, all spread across walls of glowing colour. Farmers who couldn't read Latin could still read these stories as the sun poured through them. Each pane was a sermon, each figure a symbol. The strangeness we see now is a reminder that their priorities were different. Clarity of meaning mattered more than proportion or perspective. Manuscript illuminations tell the same story. Often with humour we forget medieval people had. Margins filled with rabbits jousting, monks fighting snails, grotesque hybrids sticking tongues out at readers. These weren't mistakes. They were jokes, commentary, whimsy tucked into sacred texts. The Middle Ages weren't humorless. They were playful, even irreverent, in spaces we assume were stiff with solemnity. And universities, another area wrapped in myth, were not quiet halls of rote memorization. They were raucous, argumentative, alive. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, these places were packed with young men crammed into lodgings, often broke, often rowdy, shouting Latin insults at one another while debating Aristotle. Disputations were public, combative, and sometimes violent. Students rioted over food prices, clashed with townsfolk, even fought battles with local militias. Professors weren't distant sages. They were brawlers of ideas, sometimes literally dragged from lecture halls by angry students demanding refunds for poor teaching. And what did they debate? Not trivia. They wrestled with the nature of God, the origin of the universe, the workings of the human body, the motion of the stars. They argued about Aristotle's physics, about whether the soul had faculties, about how reason and faith could align. Far from a 1,000-year nap, the Middle Ages were a time of intellectual restlessness. Curiosity buzzed in lecture halls, monasteries, courts, and taverns alike. The myth of the Dark Ages, a long pause between Rome's fall and the Renaissance, collapses when you notice the inventions they left us. Mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, windmills, the stirrup, universities themselves, not to mention translations of Arabic and Greek texts that kept ancient knowledge alive until Europe was ready to rediscover and expand it. Without medieval scribes, we would not have Aristotle. Without Islamic scholars writing in Cordoba and Baghdad, we would not have algebra. Without craftsmen experimenting with glass and gears, we would not have the tools that powered later science. So why do we still imagine darkness? Partly because Renaissance thinkers wanted to glorify their own age by belittling the one before. They painted the medieval centuries as a void, a mistake, a lull. Enlightenment writers sharpened the insult further. casting themselves as champions of reason rising out of superstition, and modern schoolbooks, eager for simple timelines, repeated the slander. But history resists neat labels. Darkness and light were never so neatly divided. For the people who lived it, life was not shadow. It was colour, debate, laughter, ritual, invention. Their art glowed. Their universities roared. Their curiosity carried them forward, sometimes stumbling, often mistaken, but always moving. They weren't waiting for us to rescue them. They were already thinking, painting, arguing and dreaming in their own light. But myths are persistent creatures. Once planted, they're hard to uproot, especially when they serve a purpose. And the myth of the ignorant, unwashed, superstition-chained medieval world has served many purposes over the centuries. It gave Renaissance thinkers a foil to define their own brilliance. It gave Enlightenment philosophers something to rebel against. It gave Victorian moralists a story about progress and the civilizing arc of time. It gave textbook writers an easy timeline, classical brilliance, medieval gloom, modern awakening. Simple, digestible, entirely misleading. It also gave modernity a flattering mirror. If the past was brutish, dirty and irrational, then we, with our science, hygiene and liberal values, must be enlightened, clean and logical. The darker the Middle Ages, the brighter we seem by comparison. It's an ego boost baked into the narrative, but the truth is more tangled, because for every dungeon there was a debate, for every plague a poem, for every burning a cathedral rising, for every superstition a hard-won truth. When we cling to the myths, when we imagine medieval people as idiots afraid of the moon, or never touching soap, or burning women by the thousands for being witches, we flatten them. We erase their complexity. Worse, we lose something of our own. We lose the chance to see how knowledge actually grows. Not in smooth lines, but in stumbles, contradictions, breakthroughs, and revisions. We miss how much of what we now cherish was born in cloisters, smithies, lecture halls, and battlefields of that very age we dismiss. And we repeat mistakes. Every time we decide an era is dark, we risk ignoring the light within it. Every time we brand a people or culture as primitive, we blind ourselves to the layers and nuance that make them, and us, human. That's not just bad history, it's bad thinking. The truth is, medieval Europe was a world of ideas in motion, of people wrestling with meaning, with justice, with beauty, with death. They lived with fewer tools, fewer certainties, and far more danger. Yet they built systems, languages, philosophies, and stories that echo into the foundations of our world. Their world was not ours, but it wasn't alien. It was flawed, vivid, terrifying, inventive, sometimes cruel, sometimes tender, but never empty, never stupid, never silent. And if we can learn to see it with clear eyes, without mockery or misplaced nostalgia, we might learn something better than a simple timeline. We might learn humility. The ability to look at our own era not as the inevitable pinnacle of civilization, but as another flawed chapter in the longer, messier human story. History isn't a ladder. It's not a straight road. It's a maze, a field of overgrown paths, some leading forward, some sideways, some back. The Middle Ages were not a dead end. They were part of that weave, and richer than we've been told. So the next time you hear someone scoff that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat, that they feared cats were witches, or that they never smiled or washed or dreamed, remember this, they thought. They doubted. They struggled. They loved. They mattered. And maybe, just maybe, if we let go of our myths, we can finally hear what they've been trying to say for centuries. And there we close the dusty book for now. If your eyes are heavier than they were before, you're welcome. If your mind is a little sharper, even better. Thanks for wandering through time with me. Don't forget, the past isn't just what they told you in school. It's stranger, deeper, and far more alive. If you made it this far, you're part of a rare guild. The sleepless historians, the curious minds. Tap that like button, whisper a comment into the void below, and if you want more sleepy journeys into bizarre, forgotten corners of history, subscribe to The Drowsy Historian. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.